Racist woman kicked Big Shaq's disabled daughter off a playground 200 miles from home. No warning, no shame. The town watched in silence, proud of its rules. But Big Shaq didn't come to argue. Big Shaq came to bury the rules and build a reckoning. What happened next shook the ground they thought was theirs. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Tahira O'Neal had always lived beneath a canopy of care. Not a prison, but a shield. Her father, Shaquille O'Neal, known to the world as Big Shaq, was larger than life, both in frame and in heart. But to Tahira he was simply Dad, a man who could hold the world back with one hand and brush a tear from her cheek with the other. She was born with a neurological condition that affected her motor function. Wheelchair-bound since the age of 4, she'd grown up with therapy rooms, adaptive tools, and a father who never let the world define her. But even love can feel like a wall when you're 21 and aching for independence. This request was different. She'd done her research. A small suburban town called Brookvale Ridge, nestled 200 miles from their Los Angeles home, had recently launched an inclusive playground initiative that had made national headlines. Adaptive swings, sensory zones, quiet paths. It was meant to be a paradise for children and young adults with disabilities. Tahira wanted to go, not with security, not with cameras, just her and her caregiver, Rena, a quiet but fiercely loyal woman who'd been with her since childhood. Shaq listened quietly when Tahira made her case. He didn't interrupt. He didn't say no. He just watched her. And then he nodded. "You got this," he said softly. And that was that. The morning they left, Shaq stood on the porch with arms folded, watching the van pull away like it was carrying the moon. He didn't wave. He didn't cry. But something in his chest cracked. It wasn't fear. It was knowing the world wasn't built for people like his daughter. And still she was trying to meet it halfway. Brookvale Ridge was almost too perfect on the surface. Rows of clean houses with pastel shutters, kids on bikes, a bake sale sign stapled to a lamppost. The town welcomed visitors with a painted wooden sign that read, "Kindness lives here." Rena, ever skeptical, made a mental note of how tidy it all seemed. No graffiti, no loitering teens, no mess. And yet when she wheeled Tahira into the playground's main path, the smiles from the parkgoers arrived a beat too late. They lingered too long. There was a hesitation in the air, something invisible but weighty. The playground itself was modern. Smooth rubberized flooring, metal-free equipment, wide ramps, soft color palettes. It was everything the article had promised. Tahira's face lit up as she rolled toward a wind chime garden, meant for sensory play. For a moment, the world felt light. A boy in a pirate shirt smiled at her. A father waved, but that ease didn't spread far. On the bench across the sandbox, a woman in a navy cardigan stared too long. Her eyes moved between Tahira and Rena like she was reading a problem she didn't understand. That woman's name was Denise Waller. Though neither Tahira nor Rena knew that yet. She was PTA royalty, a former school administrator, and a fixture of the town's social ecosystem. Her reputation was spotless, her grip tight, her charm rehearsed. When she rose from the bench and began walking toward them, her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Elsewhere in the park, children laughed and ran. But here, time slowed. Denise bent slightly, addressing Rena, not Tahira, with a voice that wore patience like a mask. "I'm sorry," she said lightly, "but are you sure this is the right zone? This part of the park is designed for interactive play. Sometimes the devices here can be overstimulating." Tahira turned her head. "I can read the signs just fine," she said calmly. Denise blinked. That wasn't in the script. She glanced around and noticed 2 other mothers watching. She adjusted. Of course, she said, laughing airily. "It's just that sometimes the local children need space to feel comfortable too. You understand." It wasn't a request. It was a suggestion, with weight behind it. A push disguised as a smile. Rena stood, her tone cool but controlled. "We're here because this is a public, accessible playground funded by federal grants. So yes, we're exactly where we're supposed to be." Denise didn't move, neither did her smile. But her phone was already in her hand. Moments later, a man with a Parks Department badge arrived. Flustered, confused, and trying to stay neutral. "There's been a concern," he said vaguely. "We just want to make sure everyone feels safe." Tahira, silent now, backed her chair slightly away from the chimes. A boy in the pirate shirt was being called back by his mother. Eyes were on her, not out of curiosity, but surveillance. Her joy turned inward, collapsing into itself like a dying star. She didn't cry. She didn't even speak. She simply turned her chair and began rolling back toward the van. Rena followed, but not before taking out her phone and recording the scene. No shouting, no threats, just the slow, humiliating retreat of a girl who dared to show up where she wasn't silently welcome. Back in Los Angeles, Shaq was watching the game tape of an old college matchup when his phone buzzed. It was a notification, a trending video. He tapped it. He saw his daughter wheeling away from a playground. Her shoulders were tight. Her hands didn't tremble, but her face. It took only 27 seconds to break something in him. Not rage, not vengeance. Something else. Something quieter. Something deeper. The internet reacted immediately. Twitter exploded. News anchors debated. Hashtags flooded timelines. But Shaq posted nothing. He didn't go live. He didn't hire lawyers. He turned his phone face down and stared into the silence of his study. On the wall hung a photo of Tahirah, as a child perched on his shoulders, holding a tiny toy microphone. That night the world kept asking, what will Big Shaq do? But he wasn't asking that. He was asking something else. What will I build in the silence? And outside, the wind pressed gently against the glass, as if the world was holding its breath. For the first time in months, Tahirah felt something like weightlessness. Not the absence of gravity, but of watchful eyes. There were no security teams shadowing her. No flashes from fans' cameras trying to snap a piece of her father's fame. She was just a girl in a chair, coasting along a rubber path shaded by sycamore trees and lined with wind chimes. The park was quiet but alive. The murmur of children, the creak of swings, the occasional bark of a dog. Everything felt unforced, like a song humming in the background of her breath. She rolled forward, her fingers tracing the edges of a tactile board, painted in bright colors. A few feet away, Rena sat under the awning, reading quietly, her body positioned with the practiced alertness of someone used to being calm and ready. Tahirah didn't look back. She needed this moment to belong to her alone. It wasn't just about a park, it was about proving to herself more than anyone that the world could make room without needing to rearrange everything. But the moment was short-lived. From the corner of the playground, a shadow approached. At first it didn't register. A woman, tall, well-dressed, with blonde hair tied neatly into a knot, and a gold PTA badge pinned to her lapel, walked toward Tahirah with a smile that flickered, not glowed. Her steps were smooth, but they didn't carry warmth. She stopped just a few feet away, folding her hands in front of her like a practiced greeter. Her name, not that Tahirah knew it yet, was Denise Waller, and she didn't come to welcome. Denise had lived in Brookvale Ridge for over 20 years. She sat on 3 committees, chaired the school board advisory council, and was known for keeping things orderly. That meant clean lawns, whisper-quiet streets, and a very specific idea of inclusion, the kind that stayed in pamphlets, not playgrounds. The sight of Tahirah, relaxed and commanding space in the heart of her curated world, didn't sit well. Denise smiled wider. "Sweetheart," she said, with a tone that peeled like old wallpaper. "Can I ask which program you're with?" Tahirah blinked, confused by the question. She wasn't with any program. She wasn't on a tour or part of an outreach group. She was just here, on her own terms. "I'm just here," she answered flatly. Denise's smile faltered for a split second. She leaned in, lowering her voice but not her authority. "This is a shared space, you understand. We have a lot of neurosensitive kids here, and sometimes sudden movements or sounds can create distress. It's best if we keep things uniform." Tahirah sat silent, not because she didn't understand, but because she understood exactly what was happening. Denise wasn't asking for a compromise. She was asking her to leave, wrapped in a ribbon of passive concern. Rena had stood up by then, reading the air like a storm on the horizon. She approached quietly but firmly. "She has every right to be here," Rena said, voice even but edged. "This is a federally certified ADA-compliant public space." Denise's eyes narrowed just enough to register annoyance. Her words, however, remained polished. "Of course," she said, "but we've had some calls about children feeling uneasy. We simply want to make sure no one feels." She paused, searching for a word. "Disoriented." By now a few other parents were looking over. Some curious, some cautious. One woman tugged her son away from a slide, Another man leaned down to whisper to his daughter before leading her toward the sandbox. The effect was subtle but spreading, like oil slicking across water. Rena stepped in front of Tahari slightly, a silent act of shielding, but Denise didn't retreat. Instead, she lifted her phone. She wasn't filming, not yet. She was calling. Moments later, a uniformed park staff member arrived. Young, unsure, already sweating. His badge read Kenny. He looked between the three women, like someone who'd stumbled into the wrong room and didn't know how to leave. Ma'am, he began, addressing Denise first out of habit, then corrected himself. There's been someone called in about a disruption. Just trying to clarify things. There's no disruption, Rena said. There's discrimination. That's what's happening. Denise raised an eyebrow. I don't appreciate being accused of anything. You're not being accused. You're being recorded, Rena replied, holding her phone now, camera pointed squarely at Denise. The moment tightened. The bystanders weren't just watching now. They were documenting. A few more phones rose up, cautious, angled from laps or behind stroller handles. Denise straightened her posture, brushing her cardigan sleeve, as though the confrontation had dirtied her. She turned toward Kenny. For everyone's comfort, she said, I suggest she be escorted from the premises. We have rules here. The words landed like a slap in cold air. Kenny shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Denise looked around, eyes sweeping the other parents. Most avoided her gaze, but none stepped forward. One woman nodded faintly. Tahira didn't cry. Her jaw clenched slightly, but her eyes were dry. She reversed her chair slowly, moving down the rubber path toward the exit. It wasn't a retreat. It was survival. The walk of someone who'd learned long ago that presence was a threat in certain zip codes. Rena followed, keeping pace, the camera still filming as Denise turned her back and smoothed her skirt. The video caught the line, crisp cutting, fine. We have rules here. And then it ended. 20 minutes later, that clip hit social media. Within hours, it was everywhere. But back in the van, Tahira stared out the window, silent. Rena reached over, resting a hand on hers. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say. The town had shown its rules, and none of them were written down. The internet moved faster than breath. Within 6 hours of the video hitting social media, the clip of Denise Waller calmly removing Tahira O'Neal from the playground had clocked over 2 million views. Influencers dissected it frame by frame. Commentators debated it on cable panels like it was part of an election cycle. Activist pages flooded timelines with hashtags calling for justice, accountability, and reform. The phrase "we have rules here" became a chilling shorthand for weaponized civility, a rally cry for those who knew that exclusion often wore polite faces. But while the digital world lit up in outrage, Shaquille O'Neal said nothing. No press conference, no lawsuit filings, no late-night tweet threads, just silence. It wasn't the silence of a man caught off guard. It was something more deliberate. He didn't cancel appearances. He didn't call for boycotts. He simply vanished from the conversation, retreating into a quiet even those closest to him couldn't fully understand. Inside his house, the blinds stayed drawn. He didn't pace or yell. Instead, he sat in his study, elbows on his knees, shoulders slumped like he'd been carrying the weight of 1,000 headlines for years. The video played on loop, not on a phone, but on a mounted TV. He watched it not for what it showed, but for what it didn't. The smirks in the background, the quiet complicity of the crowd, the way no one questioned Denise's authority, the way Tahira didn't cry. That's what haunted him the most. Her silence wasn't shock. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. She'd seen this before, and so had he. He thought about Lucille, his mother, how she taught him as a boy to spot the difference between anger and purpose. She'd once told him, "A man who yells is reacting. A man who builds is remembering." He hadn't known what that meant until now. The noise from the outside world was deafening. Celebrities reached out privately, offering support. Civil rights attorneys offered pro bono representation. Even politicians chimed in, using the video to push for inclusive policy reform. But Shaq replied to none of them. He issued one statement through his publicist, 13 words. "I've seen this before. My daughter doesn't need noise. She needs change." That was it. Inside, the study remained dim. Framed photos lined the shelves. Tahira at her first spelling bee, on the sidelines of one of his games, in a hospital bed smiling through tubes, in her cap and gown, with a crooked tassel. She'd never asked for attention, never used his name to get access, and even in the moment she was humiliated. She didn't demand justice. She simply left. Shaq stood slowly, walking to a cabinet near the window. He opened it and pulled out an old composition notebook, worn, the cover soft at the edges. It was filled with notes he used to write when the world got too loud. Scrawled thoughts, quotes from his mother, names of people who mattered. He flipped to a blank page and wrote just one sentence. Don't let her strength excuse their cruelty. Then he closed the book. In another room, the television buzzed with talking heads. Words like institutionalized ableism, coded racism, and implicit bias bounced through the speakers. But to Shaq, it all sounded like static. He didn't need vocabulary to explain what happened. He knew he'd seen it outside locker rooms, on courts, in boardrooms, in the expressions of strangers who smiled without softness. A friend called, then another. He ignored both. It wasn't avoidance. It was clarity. The world would rage on its own. He wasn't going to be the flame. He would be the ground the fire had to reckon with. That night he sat on the porch alone, the city lights blinking beyond the treetops. He didn't replay the video. He didn't need to. It was etched into his memory now, like a scar. Tahira was safe, physically unharmed. But that wasn't the measure of damage anymore. He'd seen her since she came home. The way she smiled at him, just a beat too early. The way she joked about next time while holding her breath. She was strong, but she shouldn't have had to be. In that porch silence, he whispered something to himself. Not a vow, not a prayer, just a thought. They can't feel what they won't see. And with that he stood, walked back inside, and began pulling files from a drawer. Not legal papers, not contracts, just names. Architects, community planners, historians, former civil rights workers. He wasn't preparing a response. He was preparing a foundation. Shaquille O'Neal didn't pack much. A duffel bag, a thermos, an old notebook, and a map, a real one, folded and creased, the kind nobody used anymore but he trusted more than apps. There were no announcements, no press tailing him, no itinerary posted to social media. He walked out of his house before dawn, unlocked the heavy black pickup parked in the driveway, and drove off into the early haze. He didn't even turn the radio on. The silence felt earned. This wasn't a revenge tour. It wasn't a victory lap or a public stand. It was something quieter, something more elemental. The kind of movement born from slow-burning pain, not outrage. Tahira's name wasn't on a protest sign. It was in his lungs, his bones, his blood, and in the growl of the tires rolling over miles of unfamiliar asphalt. The interstate bled out like a ribbon of memory, guiding him away from noise and toward places time tried to forget. Each stop he made wasn't random. It was curated like chapters in a personal book. First was Baton Rouge, where he visited Coach Deacon Wallace, now long retired, living modestly in a weather-beaten house near the levee. Deacon had been the first to tell him, back when Shaq was just a kid drowning in muscle and noise, that real power doesn't raise its voice, it holds its ground. They sat on the porch for 2 hours, didn't speak much, just sipped sweet tea, and watched the river roll. When Shaq finally did talk, it wasn't about the playground. It was about how it feels when your child gets publicly told they don't belong. Deacon didn't offer solutions, just listened. And at the end he handed Shaq a name, a woman, Reverend Lorna Trask, retired, used to run a community peace center in Alabama, now living quietly near Birmingham. So Shaq drove there next. Reverend Trask had a cane, cataracts, and a voice that could still shake ceilings. When she opened the door, she didn't look surprised. She just stepped aside and said, "You're late." In her living room, surrounded by books with yellowed pages and decades of protest posters rolled into tubes, she told him about the way silence can be weaponized, how systems don't change through yelling, but through pressure, steady, focused, intelligent pressure. "You want justice, not just revenge," she said. "Good. But what are you willing to build for it?" Shaq didn't answer her then, not because he didn't know, but because he was still stitching the shape of it in his mind. She saw it in his silence, and nodded, like she'd asked the question only to confirm the answer. Next came Jackson, Mississippi. Not for the skyline, not for the politics, but for a building no one remembered anymore. A fire station long closed, half-eaten by vines, Brickwork faded from the sun. He parked across the street and stared at it. It had been decommissioned in the 80s, once part of a district where black homes were burned by accident, and the hoses rarely arrived in time. Inside that building, decades ago, a young firefighter had kept files of every denied emergency call, secret logs, names, addresses, stories never told. That firefighter was dead now, but his granddaughter, Viola Haynes, was the town archivist. Shaq met her in a diner a few blocks away. She brought a manila folder sealed with a ribbon. "My grandfather never stopped writing," she said. "He didn't think anyone would ever want these." Shaq didn't open the folder. He just held it. "I do." Viola smiled, not like a fan, but like someone handing over something sacred. He spent the night in a motel, window facing the station. Its windows were blacked out. Its roof sagged. But in the silence of that Mississippi night, Shaq saw blueprints instead of ruins. He wasn't just retracing injustice. He was collecting its blueprints, foundations laid in silence, histories erased, neighborhoods forgotten by zoning boards and planners, and mayors with perfect smiles. The miles ahead weren't a road trip. They were a map of buried roots. Every town, every name, every boarded-up building carried a piece of what he needed. But still, no one knew what he was planning. Not the activists calling for statements. Not the sponsors wondering where he'd gone. Not even Tafera, who had texted him once to say, "Just don't disappear." He hadn't. He was more present than ever, just not in the ways anyone expected. One morning, just past Little Rock, he pulled off the highway to a tiny community center built beside a church with a rusted bell. Inside he met Clem Torrance, a man in his 70s who had documented discrimination cases involving children with disabilities across rural states. Clem pulled out a hand-drawn map and pointed to counties with no ADA-compliant parks. "All these towns got grants," he said, "but nothing ever got built." Shaq stared at the map. Dozens of red dots. Dozens of towns that looked like Brookvale Ridge. Funded inclusion. No delivery. The illusion of progress without proof. That night, Shaq sat in his truck with the dome light off, flipping through pages of grant reports, city budgets, and photos of empty park lots. He wasn't looking for headlines. He was tracing patterns. And as those patterns sharpened, so did the vision that had been quietly forming since the moment his daughter turned her chair and left that playground without a sound. He wasn't just going to confront Denise Waller. He was going to render her obsolete, not by canceling her, not by suing the town, but by outbuilding their excuses. By creating something that made exclusion impossible to ignore. In the notebook he kept in the glove box, he wrote 2 words across the top of a clean page. "Reversal grounds." Then beneath it he circled a question. What if justice wasn't loud? What if it was permanent? And with that he started the engine again, headed north. Not to speak, not to rage, but to finish something deeper than retribution. He wasn't building vengeance. He was building a reckoning. Denise Waller had never been late. Not once in over 2 decades of school board meetings, fundraising galas, garden club brunches, or PTA elections. She prided herself on punctuality, on poise, on presence. The kind of woman who knew which fork to use, which tone softened resistance, which thread count felt expensive but not elitist. Her home smelled faintly of lavender. Her lawn was cut diagonally, and her social presence was curated with precision. She was a staple in Brookvale Ridge, the kind of fixture no one questioned, because she never gave them reason to. But now her hands wouldn't stop shaking. That video was everywhere. Played on loop across news tickers. Dissected by legal analysts. Mocked in viral memes. Her words, "We have rules here," were no longer her own. They had been pulled from her mouth, rearranged, and weaponized. Stripped of context, she told herself. Misunderstood, she insisted. But the truth clawed underneath all that polish, like mildew beneath paint. Denise had made calls, to the superintendent, to the town PR lead, even to a family friend on the county council. Each gave the same answer, delicately phrased in diplomatic cowardice. "You should consider stepping back while this settles." But nothing was settling. It was spreading. Her inbox brimmed with unsubscribed newsletters and passive-aggressive statements from boards she once chaired. Her neighbors, the ones who used to linger at her mailbox with compliments and fake concern, now closed doors a little too quickly. She still wore pearls to the store, still smiled at checkout clerks, but the difference was visible. They looked at her not through her, not with respect, but caution. Denise told herself it was all overblown. The girl was fine. No one had been harmed. It wasn't even a confrontation. Just a misunderstanding. That's what she rehearsed in front of the mirror. But late at night, when the lights dimmed and the online posts kept multiplying, she returned to something she had buried. The other time. It had happened 6 years ago. In a different town. Under a different title. Denise had been the assistant principal at Northfield Academy, a private charter school praised for its discipline model and high behavioral expectations. A young black student with Asperger's had a minor incident in the cafeteria. The details were never made public, because Denise made sure they wouldn't be. She called it a social mismatch in her report, rephrased outbursts as defiance, and quietly nudged the boy's family toward voluntary withdrawal. It never made headlines. The child was gone by the following Monday. No footage had existed back then. Just paper trails. Ones she filed carefully, ones she edited. But that boy's mother had written a letter. A blistering indictment no one had listened to at the time. Now somehow that letter had resurfaced. It was trending in tandem with Shaquille O'Neal's video. Screenshots flooded Reddit threads, Twitter timelines, Facebook groups. The headline stitched itself, "She's done this before." Denise had once believed the worst thing that could happen was being shouted at, publicly disgraced, confronted in some violent spectacle. But now, she realized the real terror wasn't noise. It was exposure. Not being screamed at, but being seen. And Shaq? He hadn't said a word about her. Not on television. Not on podcasts. Not even a vague tweet. His silence made her more nervous than any lawsuit ever could. She had faced angry parents before. She'd even faced threats, but his absence from the fray created a vacuum, one that people filled with suspicion, with theories, with consequences that weren't hers to control. In her community, power had always been about presence, but Shaq was rewriting the rules by not showing up. And her empire, built so delicately on etiquette and implication, was starting to crack. A journalist had knocked on her door. Twice. She hadn't answered. Emails from The Signal, a popular investigative newsletter, came daily now, asking for comment. Her lawyer advised she make a formal statement, even an apology. But Denise wouldn't. She believed in structure. Order. Surrendering would mean accepting that her carefully manicured identity was a lie. And if Denise knew one thing, it was how to control the narrative. Until now, she began attending fewer community events. When she did show up, the energy around her had changed. Polite smiles hung in the air like warnings. People laughed a beat too late, complimented her outfit but avoided her eyes. The other mothers whispered. She saw it, even when they turned away. Even the mayor, once her biggest supporter, had publicly distanced himself. Alone in her house, Denise wandered from room to room at night, replaying every moment of that afternoon at the playground. Not the way it looked online, but how it felt, the certainty she'd had in her voice, the absolute belief that she was protecting something pure. She still didn't see herself as cruel, but she was beginning to understand that cruelty isn't always loud, and it doesn't always know itself. What terrified her most wasn't the backlash. It was the fact that, for the first time, her control was not enough. Denise Waller had spent a lifetime being untouchable. She knew the right people, said the right things, wore the right mask. But masks crack, reputations unravel, and in this new world, one where silence is suspect, and receipts are eternal, her hands weren't as clean as she'd convinced herself. And somewhere, deep beneath the crumbling pedestal of her image, Denise wasn't fearing a man like Shaq. She was fearing the mirror. Shaquille O'Neal sat at her desk in the quiet hours before dawn, the kind of hour where the world hadn't yet decided how it wanted to feel. Her room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of her laptop screen, and everything outside was still. No messages buzzed, no updates blinked. The storm of the week was paused just long enough for her to find her breath, and now she was going to use it. She hadn't spoken publicly since the incident. Not a quote, not a repost, not a single word. While others shouted on her behalf, debated her experience, argued over the depth of what had happened, Tahira stayed silent, not because she was hiding, but because she knew timing was a kind of power, and hers had arrived. She opened a blank post. Her fingers hovered above the keys, trembling only for a moment. Then they moved. With intention, not hesitation. To the woman at the park. You gave me a gift I didn't ask for, and one I will never forget. You reminded me that kindness is often a costume, and inclusion is often a performance. You looked at me and didn't see a young woman exploring her world. You saw a disruption, A question mark in your perfect sentence of a town. You didn't say my name, and I won't say yours. Because this isn't about the names. It's about the system that made you feel safe doing what you did. In public on camera, with no fear. That's what breaks me more than anything you said. You were confident the world would nod with you. And for a moment it did. She paused. Hands still. Heart steady. Then continued. To the people watching. I'm not writing this for sympathy. I'm not writing this for revenge. I'm writing because silence lets rot take root. And I won't let mine feed that anymore. I've lived with a disability since I was a child. I've felt invisible in rooms full of praise. I've been ignored by waiters, talked over by doctors, and smiled at like a project instead of a person. I've been both pitied and feared, sometimes in the same breath, but never until that moment at the playground had I felt erased so efficiently. You didn't yell. You didn't insult me. You just labeled me uncomfortable. And that was enough. And I've learned that's the most dangerous thing of all. She looked over her words, not editing for softness. She didn't want this to be digestible. She wanted it to be true. There had been enough people trying to shape the narrative into one that sounded comfortable. She wouldn't be part of that. She kept typing. To the little girls who saw the video, I'm sorry you had to watch that. But I'm not sorry it happened. Because now we all get to stop pretending. I hope you remember this. You are allowed to exist. Loudly. Quietly. Awkwardly. Brilliantly. You are not a disruption just because you don't fit into someone else's design. The world needs redesigning. Not you. And then, the final paragraph. The one that would echo beyond anything she could predict. To everyone asking what my dad is going to do next. He's not coming to fight. He's coming to remind you who we are. She read it over once. Not for grammar. For pulse. It was there. Alive. Sharp and unafraid. Not polished like a press statement. Not brutal like a clapback. But piercing. She hit post. No hashtags. No images. Just words. Words that would carry. It took 17 minutes before it went viral. By the time the sun cracked the sky, it had crossed over 2 million shares. Screenshots jumped across platforms, Instagram feeds, YouTube community tabs, even the front page of Reddit. Journalists quoted it mid-broadcast. Political commentators tried to unpack it. Disability rights activists embraced it as a turning point. Even the hashtag changed, from Justice for Tahira to Who We Are. But more interesting than the reactions was the silence that followed from certain corners. Institutions that had failed to comment on the original incident were suddenly scrambling. Community leaders in Brookvale Ridge issued a vague statement of commitment to reflection. The school board opened a sudden inquiry into its diversity policies. And quietly, a federal civil rights office began reviewing ADA compliance audits in the town's records. Still, Tahira didn't do interviews. She didn't sit on talk shows. She didn't let her name become a brand. She stayed home. She let her words do the walking. And as the world turned toward her with curiosity, concern, and a craving for more, she turned her gaze somewhere else entirely. North. To where her father had gone. To what he was building. To the place not yet named, but already known. There were no reporters, no warning, just the steady hum of construction engines and the rhythmic clang of chain-link fences being unrolled and anchored. The vacant lot was on the southern edge of the same park where Tahira had been ejected, a triangle of overgrown land the town had deemed unsuitable for public use years ago. Now men in clean uniforms marked grids with orange paint, while thick sheaves of blueprints flapped in the wind, clutched in the arms of a tall foreman who didn't answer questions. By 9 a.m., Denise Waller was standing at her bay window, cordless phone in hand, mouth slightly open. From her vantage point she couldn't see much, just the tops of machinery rising above the hedges, and the silhouettes of figures moving with practiced intent. She had made 3 calls already. The city planner's office, zoning compliance, and her sister-in-law on the preservation committee. Each one gave her the same vague reply. The paperwork's clean. Fully approved. Expedited action. Expedited. That word settled in her stomach like a brick. She pulled up the county records online, digging deeper than most residents ever had a reason to. The name on the permit wasn't Shaquille O'Neal. It was a holding company, neatly registered and masked under layers of LLCs. But Denise wasn't a novice. She followed the paper trail, and by the time she reached the 3rd level of shell ownership, she saw it. The O'Neal Foundation. It didn't feel real at first. Like a rumor made flesh. Within hours, the town's nerves began to fray. At the cafe, people murmured beneath their coffee cups. At the school drop-off lines, glances were traded like currency. Nobody wanted to admit it, but everyone felt it. Something was happening, something outside their control, something too large to dismiss, too quiet to confront. By day 2, a second crew arrived, this time with surveying tools and sealed crates. Drone operators hovered above the site, mapping every foot of elevation. Still, there were no announcements, no public engagement, just action. It wasn't until the third property was purchased that the whispers turned into meetings. The new acquisitions were all adjacent: a dilapidated service building, a long empty convenience store, and most notably, a weathered colonial house that had sat untouched since its owner passed away 2 years prior. That house, Denise knew all too well. It had belonged to her father. The Waller name was once considered historic in Brookvale Ridge. Her father had served on the zoning board for 28 years, enforcing ordinances that shaped the town's manicured charm. He'd fought against developments he felt would compromise the community's character, a phrase often deployed against anything unfamiliar. He had passed quietly, without fanfare, and Denise had let the property sit. She couldn't bear to sell it to just anyone. But now it was gone, acquired quietly by the same foundation she had tried to pretend wasn't circling her life. And she had no legal footing to stop it. The town council called a private session, not open to the public. Inside, tension brewed. Council members debated everything from construction noise to possible zoning violations, though none existed. Their real concern was harder to name. They were unnerved by the power of the silence. Shaq hadn't appeared, he hadn't spoken, and still he was reshaping their town, one deed, one blueprint, one corner of land at a time. Denise attended the session in person, wearing her trademark navy blazer and pearl earrings, but her presence did little to shift the mood. She asked if the council would consider pausing the project under environmental review clauses. The town attorney politely declined. She demanded to know the purpose of the development. The city planner simply said, "It meets accessibility and educational code compliance. Beyond that, it's private land." Outside, a new banner went up on the fence of the construction site. No logos, no branding, just 3 words: coming soon. Something different. It was vague, but everyone knew it was deliberate. Later that evening, 2 teenagers, one of them on the autism spectrum, posted drone footage of the developing site. It showed a design not resembling apartments or shopping centers, but open space, winding paths, circular installations, structures that hinted at something immersive. It wasn't commercial. It wasn't private housing. It looked inviting. The footage went viral within hours, sparking speculation across platforms. Activists guessed it might be a center for therapeutic services. Parents of children with disabilities hoped it would be a model school. Bloggers suggested it was a quiet revolution in urban design, inclusion built not as a feature but a foundation. But no one really knew, and Shaq still hadn't said a word. Denise began losing sleep. She'd grown used to influence, the kind earned through decorum, not drama. But now every strategy she'd relied on, policy, pressure, presentation, had collapsed. This wasn't someone trying to destroy her. This was someone building something bigger than her, around her, without ever stepping onto her front lawn. For the first time in her life, Denise wasn't just excluded. She was irrelevant. And every night, from her window, she watched the floodlights cast strange, shifting shadows across the construction site. Machines hummed, workers moved efficiently. Something was coming, not loudly, not chaotically, but with intention, with permanence. Brookvale Ridge wasn't being attacked. It was being rewritten. In a back room of the Brookvale Ridge Historical Society, a modest, ivy-choked building tucked behind the post office, Merrick Dorsey sat hunched over a flatbed scanner that hummed like a living thing. The fluorescent light above him flickered, not from age, but as if it were straining under the weight of what it was about to witness. He had been hired quietly, no announcements, no press, and funded by a foundation that had insisted on anonymity. But Merrick, a historian and archivist with a spine forged in truth-telling, already knew who was behind the money. Shaquille O'Neal hadn't signed any of the checks personally, but Merrick recognized the fingerprints: quiet investment, surgical precision, and a hunger not for noise but for permanence. Merrick had grown up 2 counties over, raised by a grandfather who spoke in slow, careful tones about things white towns don't put in brochures. He'd learned to see what was missing. In his field, history wasn't just found, it was rescued. And in Brookvale Ridge, history had been buried, literally. He started with property records. The digital database only went back to 1978. But Merrick knew better. He requested physical ledgers stored in the annex, unopened for years, maybe decades. Dust coated the covers, like secrecy had weight. As he flipped through brittle pages, a pattern began to form. Land plots redrawn without explanation. Public zoning shifts signed under obscure resolutions, one name appearing again and again in the margins. Franklin Waller, Denise's father. The more Merrick found, the more he understood. The playground where Tahira had been shamed into silence. That had once been the location of Ridge Street School, the first and only all-black school in Brookvale Ridge. During segregation, in 1958, under the pretext of consolidation, the school was closed. Officially, it was due to population migration and structural disrepair. Unofficially, Merrick discovered it had nothing to do with numbers or bricks. The school had been thriving, over-enrolled, active in arts, known for its annual oratory contests and Sunday music assemblies. Yet it vanished. The building was demolished by 1960, and by 1962, a community park had risen in its place, pristine, whitewashed, and completely detached from the soil beneath it. No commemorative plaque, no name carved in stone, just silence. But in the margins of meeting minutes, Merrick found traces of the erasure. A vote by the zoning board, signed off in a special session. No community input, no formal referendum. The presiding chair, Franklin Waller, the language he used. A realignment toward balanced development. Balanced for whom? Merrick scanned page after page. Photographs, letters, blueprints, petitions ignored. One image haunted him most. A black and white photo of the final graduating class of Ridge Street School. Children in pressed collars and homemade dresses, smiling in a yard that no longer existed. Behind them, the school sign, half hidden by a tree limb, just legible enough to read. He posted that photo on a private board, a quiet digital museum in progress. He didn't announce it publicly, not yet. But as the uploads continued, community members started finding him. Not online, in person. Older black residents who had left Brookvale Ridge decades ago, people who had been told their memories were exaggerations, their claims impossible. Now they held the proof in their hands. One woman, in her 70s, walked into the Historical Society. With trembling fingers and tears she refused to shed. "I used to sing in that school's choir," she said. "My brother built the library shelves." Merrick listened. He documented. He let the pain take form. Within a week, the archive had doubled. Within 2, it had tripled. Testimonies poured in. Some typed, some scribbled in notebooks, others left on voicemail. Every story reinforced the same truth. Brookvale Ridge had built its reputation atop the bones of a lie. And now people were starting to notice. A journalist from a national publication reached out after a leak from the planning office. Someone had seen Merrick's board and traced the property layers. When the journalist called the mayor's office for comment, the official response was 2 words: no comment. Denise Waller, too, began to feel the temperature shift. Her father's name, once synonymous with civic leadership, began appearing in threads questioning his role in community consolidation efforts. She issued a short statement citing his lifelong dedication to growth. But the statement landed flat. She hadn't anticipated that the ghosts would come back documented and undeniable. Meanwhile, the construction site beside the park continued, now surrounded by curious onlookers who walked past the fences slowly, unsure whether they were witnessing development or judgment. The banner still read, "Something different," but to those following the revelations, it now felt like a warning. What Shaq was building wasn't just a structure. It was memory, anchored in stone. Merrick's archive was set to go live soon. Not hidden behind paywalls, not buried in academia. It would be a free, open-source memorial to truth. One page, one photograph, one uncovered injustice at a time. And it wouldn't stop at Brookvale Ridge. It would be a template for towns just like it. But this town, it was the beginning. The first community to learn that burying a school doesn't bury its legacy. That removing a name from records doesn't erase the children who once raised their hands in its halls. The past was no longer content to stay hidden. It had been scanned, recorded, and given voice. And now the question no one could answer whispered through every corridor of town hall. Every unmarked map, every forgotten page. Can a town built on erasures survive the truth? It was late autumn when the fences finally came down. No ribbon-cutting ceremony. No press spectacle. Just the quiet groan of hinges, and the slow, graceful swing of gates opening for the first time. The sun crept over the town of Brookvale Ridge, with a cautious light that morning, brushing golden rays against steel ramps, sensory walls, musical walkways, and curved pathways built wide enough for chairs and joy to move side by side. What stood now on the land, once buried under weeds, and history was something Brookvale had never seen before, and perhaps never deserved. Tahira's Garden. The name wasn't painted in neon or carved in marble. It was engraved into a simple wooden arch at the entrance, where wildflowers climbed the posts and Braille was etched beneath each letter. It didn't scream to be seen. It welcomed. The garden was more than a playground. It was a sanctuary of intention. Every corner, every bench, every path had been designed with care that could only come from experience. Lived, not imagined. There were sound domes for children who struggled with loud environments, adaptive sports zones, communication boards, tactile panels, therapy animals and shade canopies that whispered calm instead of buzzing fluorescence. Even the slides curved lower and slower to honor every child's timeline. There were no normal lanes. There was no division between them and us. There were just children and access. And watching from a quiet distance on the opening day, without security detail or cameras, stood Shaquille O'Neal, hands in his jacket pockets, eyes focused not on the architecture, but on the kids. Dozens of them, some in wheelchairs, some walking unevenly, some with service dogs, some twirling and shouting with abandon, all of them belonging. Tahira stood beside him, silent, her hands folded, eyes full but unreadable. She hadn't cried during construction, hadn't flinched during the media frenzy. But now, as a boy missing both legs threw his head back in laughter near the scent garden, her throat closed around something too heavy to name. Shaq didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He just squeezed her shoulder once, a quiet punctuation. Behind the garden's design stood an army of planners, therapists, and trauma-informed volunteers. They had been hired not to protect, but to understand. No uniforms, no whistles, just presence and care. By the end of the first week, the original Brookvale Ridge playground, the one Tahira had been ordered to leave, sat mostly empty, not officially closed, just forgotten, rusting slightly at the edges, fading into its own irrelevance. The garden, however, bloomed. National outlets began reporting on it within days. Architectural journals called it a landmark in adaptive play design. Educators asked for the blueprint. Disability advocates named it one of the most inclusive recreational spaces in the country. But Shaq didn't sit for interviews. His only public statement came through a hand-typed plaque nailed beside the entrance. This is not an answer. This is an offering. We don't erase the old ground. We plant over it, so the next child won't have to fight to stay. Meanwhile, the undercurrents in town turned turbulent. Civil rights groups, galvanized by Merrick Dorsey's archival revelations, filed formal discrimination complaints against the Brookvale School Board, targeting historic zoning decisions, including the park-to-school erasure led by Franklin Waller. Denise Waller, once shielded by legacy and silence, found herself named in multiple ethics investigations, not for the playground incident alone, but for the patterns that now had paper trails, video and community voices behind them. Her fall wasn't cinematic, it was quiet. Cold shoulders, withdrawn invitations, a seat left empty at every table she used to command. The people who once echoed her sentiments now avoided her entirely, not out of fear, out of shame. She stayed indoors mostly, except for one evening when she walked past the edge of the garden, far enough not to enter, close enough to see the silhouettes dancing in twilight. And in that blur of laughter and motion, her eyes caught on something unexpected. A tall young man, maybe 18, maybe 20, helping a girl navigate a sand path with her walker. He wasn't wearing a volunteer badge, but he moved like someone who belonged there, not just worked there. She stopped breathing for a moment. It was her son, Eli. He hadn't told her, hadn't asked permission. He had just shown up and stayed. At home, he had been distant, detached since the video, unwilling to engage in her explanations. She had assumed it was shame, rebellion, but now she saw it, in the way he crouched to match the child's eye level, in the way he listened when she spoke, in the way he let her finish without rushing her. He had made a choice. Not to stand against her, but to stand for something else. Denise didn't enter the garden. She couldn't. Not because she was banned, but because her presence didn't belong in the soil it had been built upon. She turned and walked away, shoulders squared but spirit frayed. Back in the garden, Eli continued working, anonymously. He never used his last name. No one asked. That was the culture now. Assumption-free, dignity first. And the children? They only knew he was kind. Week by week the town changed. Not through protests or policies, but presence. More volunteers arrived. More families from nearby towns visited. Some drove for hours just to let their child play without being stared at or shushed. Tahira visited often. Not as a symbol, not as a guest, just as herself. She rolled through the herb tunnels, spent hours under the reading dome, helped train staff in emotional sensitivity. Her post had gone quiet, but her impact had not. Shaq remained mostly in the background. Hands-on, yes, but never centered. He walked the paths at night when no one was around, checking the lights, feeling the air, listening. And as winter came, the garden stayed open. Heated paths, warm stations, and community support that refused to let inclusion hibernate. Tahira's garden wasn't a retaliation. It was a monument to what happens when you plant light in the cracks. The sun filtered softly through the limbs of the oak tree standing tall at the center of Tahira's garden, a tree that hadn't been there a season ago, but now stretched skyward, as if it had always belonged. Beneath its shade was a circle of benches, all positioned inward, forming a quiet gathering place that invited connection. It is here that Shaquille O'Neal stood, not flanked by press, not staged on a platform, but grounded, feet firm on the soil that had once tried to forget people like his daughter. No podium, no microphones, just families, volunteers, children, and the rustle of late autumn leaves catching wind. The plaque behind him was modest, carved into a stone at the tree's base. Justice doesn't scream, it grows. Shaq looked around, scanning the faces, mothers wiping quiet tears, fathers standing with arms crossed and eyes glassy, children climbing gently over each other, in a chorus of laughter and care. Every detail of the garden had led to this moment, yet no one had planned for it to happen this way. He took a breath, deep, measured, and then he spoke. I've been a lot of things in my life. Athlete, entertainer, businessman, but none of that taught me what my daughter did just by rolling away from a place that tried to shrink her. The crowd didn't shift or stir. They listened. She didn't yell. She didn't protest. She just removed herself from a space that made her small. That's grace. That's power. That's what I had to learn to follow. He paused, letting the silence sit. Not as a void, but as part of the message. My mother used to tell me something when I was young, when the world didn't always clap when I walked into a room. She'd say, don't answer with volume, answer with value. For a long time I thought that meant proving myself on courts and stages. But she was talking about moments like this, when you have every right to rage, but choose to rebuild. He glanced toward Tahira, seated a few feet away. She gave no expression, just held his gaze, steady, strong. There's something dangerous about a place that teaches you to smile while it excludes you, he said. Places like that survive not because they're loud, but because they're comfortable. Brookvale Ridge was comfortable in its silence. Until it wasn't. A few heads bowed slightly. He wasn't condemning the town. He was unearthing it. This garden, he continued, gesturing around him, was built on ground that tried to forget a school. A school full of black kids, with big minds, and bigger dreams. That wasn't an accident. That was design. And now, this is our redesign. The crowd remained still. But the energy shifted. Tension unraveled. Truth moved through them, like wind bending grass. We didn't come here to cancel anybody. We came here to make cancellation impossible, he said. You can't erase what's been built in love and truth and sweat. And the beauty of that? It outlasts any one of us. A toddler nearby giggled. The sound carried. Shaq smiled. My daughter taught me that justice doesn't always look like courtroom wins or headlines. Sometimes it's a ramp that didn't exist before. A bench where every body feels welcome. A sign in Braille. A song that plays in more than one language. He turned for the first time to face the oak tree fully. He touched the plaque at its base, fingers resting on the words, "This isn't about me. Or her. Or even this town." Then he looked back to the group. More than 50 now, standing in concentric circles of quiet attention. This is about what happens next. What each of us decides to plant in the ground we're standing on. Whether we ignore the roots or grow something from them. Another pause. Purpose. I'm not here to fix what's broken, he said softly. I'm here to grow over it, so it can't break anyone else again. There was no applause. Not because they weren't moved, but because the moment didn't ask for it. It asked for reflection. Shaq stepped back, nodding once toward Tahira, who rolled forward and took her place beside him beneath the oak. The garden around them hummed with new life, not just from children, but from awareness, from action, from intention. And just before the moment dissolved into the rhythm of ordinary joy, Shaq said the last words he would speak aloud that day. We don't tear it all down. We build something louder. What happened in Brookvale Ridge isn't fiction, it's a mirror. If this story stirred something in you, don't just remember it. Reflect it. Ask where your town hides its silence. Ask who's still being asked to leave. Change doesn't begin with noise. It begins with noticing. And the next blueprint? It might be yours.